Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey through time, tracing the intricate story of a plant that has shaped civilizations, sparked debates, and transformed lives for thousands of years. Cannabis, a simple word that carries the weight of millennia, wrapped in controversy, steeped in tradition, and colored by everything from ancient healing practices to modern political movements. Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of deep historical exploration designed to help you drift into peaceful sleep, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, share where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how our community spans the globe, all of us connected by curiosity and the desire to learn while we rest. Now, silence your notifications, find a comfortable position, take a slow, deep breath, and let's travel back in time together. The ancient origins. Seeds on the steppe. Our story begins not with laws or controversies, but with a seed. A simple seed carried by the wind across the vast steppes of Central Asia, landing in soil that would nurture it into a tall, fibrous plant. This was long before anyone gave it a name, long before it became entangled in human politics or morality. It was simply a plant, one among countless others, growing wild beneath an endless sky. The earliest archaeological evidence of human interaction with cannabis takes us to the Neolithic period, roughly 8,000 years ago, in what is now northern China. In the low soils of the Yellow River Basin, archaeologists have uncovered hemp fibers and seeds in sites associated with the Yanghai and Hemudu cultures. These ancient farmers, who were already skilled at weaving and cord making, recognized something valuable in this particular plant. Its stalks could be pulled into strong fibers, twisted into rope that wouldn't easily break. Its seeds could be eaten, providing nourishment, or pressed into oil that could light a lamp or season food. But the most remarkable discovery came much later, in the early 21st century, when archaeologists excavated a tomb in the Yanghai cemetery near Turpan, in China's Xinjiang region. The tomb, designated M90, held the remains of a man who lived approximately 2,700 years ago. He was likely a shaman, given the artifacts buried with him: bridles for horses, archery equipment, a Kongho harp, and near his head and feet, containers holding nearly 800 grams of dried cannabis. What made this discovery extraordinary wasn't just the age of the material or its remarkable preservation in the dry climate and alkaline soil of the Tarim Basin. It was what the plant material revealed when scientists subjected it to modern analysis. The cannabis in that tomb wasn't the tall, fibrous hemp cultivated for rope. It was rich in the very compounds that affect human consciousness, the cannabinoids that would later be given names like THC and CBD. The plant had been selected, carefully tended, and harvested for its psychoactive and medicinal properties. This 2,700-year-old cache represents the oldest physical evidence we have of humans cultivating cannabis specifically for its mind-altering effects. The people who placed that cannabis in the shaman's tomb understood something profound about this plant. They recognized that it held power, not just to bind physical objects together with strong rope, but to bind the human spirit to something beyond the ordinary world. In shamanic traditions across Central Asia, altered states of consciousness were gateways to the divine, to ancestors, to healing visions that could guide a community through times of crisis. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described what he witnessed among the Scythians, nomadic people who roamed the steppes north of the Black Sea. He wrote of their morning rituals, how they would set up small tents and throw hemp seeds onto hot stones. The tents would fill with thick vapor, and the people inside would howl with pleasure, their minds transported by the smoke. Herodotus was careful in his observations, noting that this wasn't mere recreation but part of their sacred customs, their way of honoring the dead and cleansing themselves spiritually. These ancient uses reveal something essential about cannabis's relationship with humanity. From the very beginning, this plant occupied a dual role. It was practical, providing fiber for rope and cloth, seeds for food, oil for lamps. But it was also mystical, offering access to altered states that societies across Eurasia wove into their spiritual and medicinal practices. This duality, this ability to be both mundane and sacred, would follow cannabis through every chapter of its long history with human civilization. As centuries passed, different cultures selected different traits in the plant. In the temperate fields of China and the Baltic regions, farmers favored tall, straight stalks with long, strong fibers. These became what we now call industrial hemp, plants bred over generations to maximize their usefulness for textiles and rope. In warmer climates, particularly in the mountains and valleys of India, Afghanistan, and the Hindu Kush, people selected for something different: compact plants with dense, resinous flowers. These became the drug cultivars, plants rich in the compounds that would later be isolated and studied in modern laboratories. This divergence in selection created what botanists would eventually recognize as distinct varieties, though they remained the same species. The plant that could clothe you, build your shelter, and equip your ships was also the plant that could ease your pain, quiet your anxiety, and open doorways in your mind. Ancient peoples didn't see these as contradictions. They were simply different gifts from the same generous plant. Medical traditions of the ancient world. As civilizations grew more complex, so did their uses of cannabis. The plant found its way into the medical texts of virtually every major ancient culture, from China to India to the Mediterranean world. These weren't folk remedies passed down by word of mouth alone, though such traditions certainly existed. These were carefully recorded medical protocols, written down by physicians who observed their patients, noted what worked and what didn't, and passed their knowledge to future generations. In China, the legendary figure of Shen Nong looms large in the history of herbal medicine. Known as the Divine Farmer, Shen Nong was said to have tasted hundreds of herbs to catalog their effects on the human body. While Shen Nong himself is likely mythological, the text attributed to him, the Shen Nong Ben Cao Jing, represents a compilation of herbal knowledge that stretches back thousands of years. Cannabis appears in this text, respected as a useful plant with multiple applications. The seeds were recognized as nourishing, a source of nutrition during times when food was scarce. The flowers found use in various medicinal preparations. Later Chinese medical texts, particularly Li Shizhen's monumental Compendium of Materia Medica, compiled during the Ming Dynasty, treated cannabis with the methodical attention that characterized traditional Chinese medicine. Physicians prescribed cannabis-based preparations for constipation, as a diuretic, and as an ingredient in topical plasters applied to swollen joints. The approach was cautious and specific. Cannabis wasn't seen as a cure-all, but as one tool among many in the physician's kit to be used in appropriate circumstances and proper dosages. Across the Himalayas in India, cannabis wove itself even more deeply into both medical and spiritual life. The ancient Vedic texts, some of the oldest religious writings in the Indo-European family, mention cannabis, or bhang, as it was called in Sanskrit. The Atharva Veda speaks of it as one of the 5 sacred plants, referring to it as an herb that releases us from anxiety. This wasn't just poetic language. It reflected practical experience with the plant's effects on human consciousness and well-being. The great compendia of Ayurveda, traditional Indian medicine, treated cannabis with the same careful attention given to hundreds of other medicinal plants. The Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita, texts compiled over many centuries, describe cannabis as therapeutic when used carefully. It could aid digestion, act as a sedative, or serve as part of anesthetic mixtures for surgical procedures. The surgeon Sushruta, whose writings on surgery and anatomy were remarkably advanced for their time, included cannabis among the substances used to dull pain and make incisions survivable. In ancient Egypt, medical knowledge was preserved on papyri, long scrolls that combined what we would now call magic and medicine in ways that made sense to their practitioners. The Ebers Papyrus, dated to around 1550 BCE, includes recipes for treating various ailments. Among the ingredients listed, scholars have identified what appears to be cannabis, though the exact translation of ancient Egyptian plant names remains debated. Egyptian physicians used it, along with frankincense and other aromatics, to treat inflammation, eye conditions, and the pain of childbirth. The ancient Greeks and Romans approached cannabis with their characteristic blend of curiosity and practicality. Herodotus, always the careful observer of foreign customs, described not just the Scythian vapor baths, but also the practical uses of hemp for rope and textiles. Later Greek physicians incorporated this knowledge into their medical systems. Pedanius Dioscorides, a Greek physician serving with the Roman army in the 1st century CE, compiled his observations into De Materia Medica, a comprehensive guide to medicinal substances that would influence medical practice for more than 1,000 years. In his text, Dioscorides describes cannabis as useful for treating earaches, particularly using the root boiled down into a preparation that could be dripped into the ear. He also mentioned its use in ointments to relieve various forms of pain. Pliny the Elder, in his exhaustive natural history, commented on hemp's multiple applications. He noted the strength of its fibers, which made it valuable for ropes and sails. He recorded the nutritional value of its seeds, and he described its medicinal uses, including treatments for joint pain and inflammation. For Pliny, cannabis was one piece in the vast puzzle of nature's gifts to humanity, worthy of study and practical application. Perhaps most influential for later European medicine was the work of Galen, the Greek physician whose medical theories would dominate Western medicine for more than 1,000 years. Galen, working in Rome in the 2nd century CE, organized much of the scattered medical knowledge of his time into a coherent system. He included plant-based painkillers and topical agents in his pharmacopoeia, substances that physicians could reach for when treating patients. Cannabis appeared in these lists, not prominently, but present nonetheless as one more tool in the healing arts. The Islamic Golden Age and medieval medicine. When the Roman Empire fragmented and Europe entered its so-called Dark Ages, medical knowledge found new life in the Islamic world. The translation movement centered in Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate preserved Greek and Roman medical texts, translating them into Arabic and building upon them with new observations and theories. Two physicians stand out in this tradition for their influence on both Islamic and later European medicine: Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, and Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna. Al-Razi, working in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, was a polymath who wrote extensively on medicine, chemistry, and philosophy. His medical writings included discussions of cannabis's effects and potential therapeutic uses, building on both Greek sources and contemporary Arabic medical knowledge. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, compiled in the early 11th century, became one of the most important medical textbooks in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. When it was eventually translated into Latin, it became a standard text in European medical schools, used for centuries. Ibn Sina's canon describes cannabis among many medicinal substances, noting its uses for treating pain and inflammation, always with careful attention to dosage and preparation. The care with which Islamic physicians approached cannabis reflected broader principles in their medical practice. They believed in balance, in matching treatments to individual patients' constitutions, in using the minimum effective dose. Cannabis-based preparations appeared in their pharmacopoeias, not as miracle cures, but as specific remedies for specific conditions, to be used with the same caution one would apply to any powerful substance. Ibn al-Baitar, working in 13th century Andalusia, compiled an even more comprehensive herbal, drawing on sources from across the Islamic world and beyond. His massive work listed cannabis among hundreds of medicinal plants, describing its various preparations and uses across different regions. His pages reveal a Mediterranean and North African tradition of cannabis medicine, where skilled apothecaries prepared tinctures and oils, measuring doses with the precision of craftsmen who understood that the line between medicine and poison often lay in the dose. But cannabis in the Islamic world wasn't purely medical. It also entered into complex religious and social debates that would echo through the centuries. Islamic law clearly prohibited khamr, intoxicants, based on the Quranic prohibition of wine. But cannabis presented a question. Was it the same as wine, therefore forbidden, or different enough to be permissible, at least for medical use? Different jurists, the scholars of Islamic law, came to different conclusions. Some condemned cannabis explicitly, treating its intoxication as equivalent to wine's and therefore sinful. Others allowed it limited medical use, drawing a distinction between medicine and recreation. Still others took more nuanced positions, recognizing that the plant's status might depend on how it was used, by whom, and for what purpose. These debates weren't merely academic. They had real consequences for how cannabis was cultivated, traded, and consumed across the vast Islamic world. In some regions and periods, cannabis was tolerated, even common. In others, it faced active suppression. The pattern reveals something important about how societies negotiate with powerful substances. The rules are never as simple as legal or illegal. Context matters, purpose matters, and the same substance can be medicine in one situation and vice in another. Cannabis also found a place, sometimes controversially, in certain mystical traditions within Islam. Some Sufi orders, the ecstatic mystics who sought direct experience of the divine through practices like whirling dance and extended meditation, occasionally used hashish, concentrated cannabis resin, as an aid to achieving altered states. This practice was never universal among Sufis, and many orders explicitly forbade it, insisting that the path to God required discipline, not chemical shortcuts. But the association between cannabis and mystical practice left its mark on how the wider society viewed both the plant and those who used it. Hemp and empire, the age of exploration. While cannabis's psychoactive properties generated religious and medical debates, its fibers were building empires. From the 16th through the 19th centuries, hemp rope literally held together the great age of sail, when European powers sent fleets across the world's oceans to trade, conquer, and colonize. Imagine a warship of the line in the 17th or 18th century, a massive wooden vessel bristling with cannons, its masts rising like forest trees, supporting acres of canvas sail. Every rope on that ship, from the thickest anchor cable to the finest rigging, was made of hemp. The sails themselves were woven hemp canvas, heavy enough to catch the wind and durable enough to resist salt spray and tropical sun. Without hemp, there would have been no age of sail, no Spanish treasure fleets, no Dutch East India Company, no British Royal Navy ruling the waves. The scale of this hemp economy was staggering. A single large warship required miles of rope and thousands of square feet of canvas. Fleets required hemp by the ton. And because hemp rope deteriorated, needing constant replacement, the demand was continuous and insatiable. Nations that could supply their own hemp had a strategic advantage. Those that couldn't were vulnerable. This reality shaped European geopolitics for centuries. The Baltic region, particularly ports in what are now Estonia and Latvia, became critical suppliers of hemp to Western European navies. Merchants in Amsterdam, Lübeck, and London traded in hemp as actively as they traded in spices or precious metals. The Russian Empire, under Peter the Great's ambitious modernization program in the early 18th century, invested heavily in hemp cultivation to supply the navy he was building from scratch. Peter the Great's approach was characteristically forceful. He recognized that naval power required reliable supplies of naval stores, tar, timber, and above all, hemp. He redirected provincial economies toward hemp production, organized the growing and processing of hemp on a state level, and ensured that his new navy at St. Petersburg would have the rope it needed. In Peter's Russia, hemp wasn't just an agricultural commodity, it was a strategic resource, as important to national security as gunpowder. The cultivation and processing of hemp was labor-intensive. Hemp was planted densely, the stalks growing tall and straight in competition with each other, which produced the long fibers needed for quality rope. After harvest, the stalks went through a process called retting, where they were submerged in water for days or weeks. Bacteria would break down the pectin, binding the outer fibers to the woody core, making it possible to separate them. After retting came breaking, scutching, and hackling, a series of processes that removed the woody bits and combed the fibers until they could be spun into thread. This was not mechanized work, not in the early modern period. It required countless hands, often women and children, engaged in the tedious labor of preparing fibers. In rope walks, long corridors that stretched for hundreds of yards, teams of workers would walk backward, spinning and twisting fibers into progressively thicker strands, then ropes. The work was repetitive, physically demanding, and essential. Without it, ships stayed in port, and empires contracted. European colonial powers carried hemp cultivation to their new territories. Spanish conquistadors brought hemp to the Americas, both for ship repair and because familiar crops provided a sense of continuity in strange lands. English colonists in Virginia, Maryland, and New England planted hemp almost from the beginning, seeing it as they saw wheat or livestock, a necessary component of a functioning economy. George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson experimented with different hemp varieties at Monticello, recording his observations in the meticulous journals he kept on farming matters. For these early Americans, hemp was simply good agriculture. It grew reliably in their climate, it improved soil for future crops, and it produced a marketable commodity. There was no controversy in it, no moral dimension. It was a crop like any other, albeit one with unusual importance for national independence. American-grown hemp meant American ships could be built and maintained without relying on foreign suppliers, a matter of strategic concern to a young nation that had just fought a war for independence. Colonial expansion and new markets. As European empires extended their reach across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, cannabis moved with them, often in unexpected ways. Spanish and Portuguese colonizers, French traders, Dutch merchants, and British administrators all encountered cannabis in various forms in the regions they colonized, and they responded to it in different ways depending on local circumstances and imperial priorities. In the Caribbean and parts of South America, enslaved Africans brought their own knowledge of cannabis, which they had known in various forms in their homelands. These traditions, mixing with indigenous knowledge and European attitudes, created new hybrid practices. Cannabis became one strand in the complex cultural tapestry of the African diaspora, where people creatively adapted, resisted, and negotiated with the dominant colonial culture. In India, which would become central to the cannabis story in later centuries, the British encountered a sophisticated culture of cannabis use that had roots stretching back millennia. Indians distinguished between different preparations. Bhang, made from leaves and consumed as a drink, often mixed with milk and spices. Ganja, the dried flowering tops typically smoked. And charas, hand-rolled resin, the most concentrated and potent form. These weren't fringe practices. They were woven into daily life, into festivals, into medical practice, into the social fabric of a complex civilization. The British colonial administration in India faced a dilemma. Cannabis use was widespread and deeply rooted in Indian culture. Attempting to ban it entirely would have been enormously difficult and potentially destabilizing. But allowing it freely raised concerns among certain British officials and missionaries who viewed any intoxicant with suspicion, particularly one used by colonized peoples whose autonomy they were working to suppress. The solution they eventually arrived at was typical of British imperial governance: regulation rather than outright prohibition, control through taxation and licensing. Cannabis cultivation, sale, and use would be monitored, taxed, and officially sanctioned within certain limits. This approach maximized revenue for the colonial government while maintaining a degree of social control. But before settling on this regulatory compromise, the British government commissioned an extraordinarily thorough inquiry. The Indian Hemp Drugs Commission of 1893 to 1894 was one of the most comprehensive studies of cannabis ever undertaken. The commission traveled across India, interviewing thousands of people: users, physicians, religious figures, local officials, and ordinary citizens. They gathered testimony from diverse perspectives, and produced a multi-volume report that ran to thousands of pages. The Commission's findings were nuanced and, to many prohibitionists, disappointing. They concluded that moderate cannabis use, in the forms commonly practiced in India, posed little threat to health or social order. The supposed connection between cannabis and violent crime, heavily promoted by some missionaries and temperance activists, found little support in the evidence. The Commission recommended continued regulation rather than prohibition, a system that would allow authorities to monitor and tax cannabis while respecting established cultural practices. This report would later be largely ignored by prohibitionists in other countries, particularly the United States, but it stands as an early example of evidence-based drug policy, an attempt to let facts rather than moral panic guide legislation. Enter Dr. O'Shaughnessy. Cannabis meets Western medicine. The British presence in India produced another significant development in cannabis history, the introduction of cannabis-based medicine to Western medical practice. The key figure in this story is William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, an Irish physician who arrived in India in 1833 as an assistant surgeon with the East India Company. O'Shaughnessy was a remarkable polymath. Over his career in India, he would make significant contributions to several fields. He helped develop intravenous fluid therapy for cholera patients. He conducted early experiments in telegraphy that would lead to India's first telegraph system, and he worked on pottery, chemistry, and numerous other scientific pursuits. But his most enduring legacy was his systematic study of cannabis as a medicine. When O'Shaughnessy arrived in Calcutta, he was a young man eager to make his mark in medical research. He quickly became interested in the local materia medica, the array of plant-based medicines used in Indian medical traditions. Cannabis, which he knew as ganja or cannabis indica, was one of many substances he investigated, but it became his most famous subject. O'Shaughnessy's approach was methodical and empirical. He began by reviewing the historical and contemporary use of cannabis in Indian medicine, consulting with local practitioners and reading medical texts. Then he conducted his own experiments, first on animals, to understand the substance's effects and establish what seemed to be safe dosages. Finally, he began treating human patients with cannabis preparations, carefully documenting the results. His most famous case involved a 40-day-old infant suffering from severe convulsions. The baby had been having increasingly frequent seizures, and conventional treatments had failed. The parents were desperate. O'Shaughnessy, having seen cannabis used successfully for convulsive conditions, proposed trying a cannabis tincture. The parents agreed. After receiving the medicine, the infant fell asleep and slept peacefully for hours. When she woke, she was hungry and nursed normally. The convulsions didn't return. O'Shaughnessy treated other patients as well, people suffering from rheumatism who found their pain eased, patients with tetanus whose muscle spasms lessened, and various others with conditions ranging from cholera to rabies. He wasn't claiming that cannabis cured these diseases, but he documented that it could relieve symptoms and reduce suffering, which for 19th century medicine was often the most that could be hoped for. In 1839, O'Shaughnessy presented his findings to the Medical and Physical Society of Calcutta, reading a lengthy paper that detailed his experiments and clinical observations. The reception was positive. His colleagues recognized the careful scientific method behind his work, even if some remained skeptical about this unfamiliar medicine. More importantly, when O'Shaughnessy returned to England a few years later, he brought cannabis with him, both samples of the plant and copies of his papers. He presented his work to the Royal Society and to British pharmaceutical companies. The effect was dramatic. Within a few years, cannabis extracts and tinctures appeared in British pharmacies. Cannabis became a recognized medicine in the Victorian pharmacopoeia, prescribed by respectable physicians for a range of conditions. From Britain, knowledge of cannabis medicine spread across Europe and to North America. By the mid-19th century, you could walk into a pharmacy in London, Paris, or New York and purchase cannabis tinctures with as little ceremony as buying aspirin today. Pharmaceutical companies like Parker Davis manufactured standardized cannabis extracts. Medical journals published articles about appropriate uses and dosages. Cannabis had entered mainstream medicine, Victorian medicine, and the rise of pharmaceuticals. The latter half of the 19th century saw cannabis become increasingly integrated into Western medical practice, even as that practice itself was undergoing profound changes. This was the era when medicine was transforming from an art based largely on tradition and observation into a science grounded in laboratory research and chemical analysis. Cannabis preparations appeared in official pharmacopoeias, the authoritative lists of approved medicines maintained by national medical authorities. The United States Pharmacopoeia, for instance, listed cannabis as a recognized medicine from 1854 through 1942. Physicians prescribed it for a wide range of conditions, as a painkiller, as a treatment for migraines, as an aid for menstrual cramps, as a sedative, and sometimes as an appetite stimulant for patients wasting away from chronic illness. But cannabis medicine in this era faced a fundamental problem that would ultimately contribute to its decline: standardization. Cannabis is not a single chemical compound. It's a complex plant containing dozens of cannabinoids and hundreds of other compounds, and the exact chemical composition varies depending on the strain, growing conditions, and how the plant is processed. This made it nearly impossible to create standardized preparations with predictable effects. A physician prescribing a cannabis tincture in 1880 couldn't be certain that the medicine would have the same strength as a different bottle from a different manufacturer, or even the same strength as a different batch from the same manufacturer. This lack of standardization frustrated physicians who were increasingly influenced by the growing prestige of laboratory science and its emphasis on precise measurement and reproducibility. The problem was exacerbated by how cannabis was processed. Most Victorian-era cannabis medicines were alcohol-based tinctures or crude extracts. The active compounds in cannabis are not very soluble in alcohol, and they're sensitive to heat and light, degrading over time. A tincture that was potent when first prepared might be much weaker a few months later, and there was no easy way to test its strength. By the end of the 19th century, chemists were beginning to isolate and purify active compounds from medicinal plants. Morphine, extracted from opium, became the standard painkiller in hospitals. Aspirin, a synthetic derivative of compounds found in willow bark, was introduced in 1899 and quickly became the model of a modern medicine. A single, pure compound with known properties, easy to dose precisely. Cannabis, with its complex chemistry that wasn't yet understood, began to seem old-fashioned by comparison. When physicians could prescribe morphine for pain or aspirin for headaches, with reliable, reproducible effects, why struggle with unpredictable cannabis preparations? The plant didn't disappear from medicine immediately, but its use began to decline, particularly in hospitals and among scientifically minded physicians. Yet cannabis remained available throughout this period. Patent medicines, the often dubious remedies sold directly to consumers through advertisements and mail order, frequently contained cannabis alongside opiates and alcohol. These mixtures, with names like Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup or Dr. Brown's Mixture, made all sorts of extravagant claims. Many probably did nothing, or worse than nothing, but some, because they contained actual cannabis and opiates, genuinely relieved pain and anxiety, even as they potentially created dependence. The patent medicine trade represented the wild, unregulated frontier of Victorian medicine, and it would become a target for reformers who wanted to bring order and scientific rigor to pharmaceuticals. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 in the United States was partly a response to the patent medicine industry's excesses. The law required honest labeling of medicines, listing their actual ingredients and ceasing to make false claims. It didn't ban cannabis or opiates, but it began to impose structure on a chaotic market. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, cannabis occupied an odd position. It was legally available, occasionally prescribed by physicians, sometimes included in patent medicines, but increasingly seen as old-fashioned and unreliable compared to the new generation of pharmaceuticals. It wasn't yet controversial. There were no moral panics about it, no lurid newspaper stories, no calls for prohibition. That would come soon enough, but the story's next chapter would unfold not in pharmacies and medical journals, but in courtrooms, police stations, and the murky intersection of politics, prejudice, and the press. The Prohibition era. From medicine to menace. The transformation of cannabis from a recognized medicine to a prohibited drug happened remarkably quickly, mostly in the span of the 1920s and 1930s. This dramatic shift wasn't driven primarily by new scientific discoveries about the plant's dangers. Instead, it emerged from a complex mix of factors: racial prejudice, economic interests, institutional politics, and effective propaganda. The immediate trigger was migration. The Mexican Revolution, beginning in 1910, displaced hundreds of thousands of people who fled north into the United States, particularly into Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. These migrants brought their culture with them, including the practice of smoking cannabis for recreation and medicine, a practice more common in Mexico than it had been in most of the United States. The word marijuana itself reflected this Mexican connection. It was a Spanish slang term for cannabis, not commonly used in English before this period. Americans who grew hemp for fiber, and physicians who prescribed cannabis tinctures generally used the words cannabis or hemp, but marijuana, with its foreign sound, would become the term used by those campaigning against the plant, precisely because it emphasized the substance's association with Mexican immigrants. The 1920s and 30s were a period of intense racial anxiety in the United States. The Ku Klux Klan was at a historic peak of membership and influence. Immigration restrictions targeted undesirable groups. Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation in the South. Into this poisonous atmosphere came stories, often wildly exaggerated or entirely fabricated, linking marijuana to violence, sexual immorality, and insanity, particularly among Mexican and African American communities. Local jurisdictions acted first. Cities and states, particularly in the Southwest, began passing ordinances against marijuana in the 1920s. These laws were often explicitly motivated by racial prejudice, with officials speaking openly about the need to control Mexican and African American populations. Enforcement was selective and discriminatory, with police more likely to arrest and prosecute people of color than white users. At the federal level, the key figure pushing for prohibition was Harry J. Anslinger, who became commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics when it was established in 1930. Anslinger was a bureaucrat with a gift for publicity and a willingness to use any tactic to advance his cause. He needed a cause. Alcohol prohibition had just been repealed in 1933, which left drug enforcement agencies looking for a new mission to justify their continued existence and funding. Anslinger chose marijuana as his target. Over the next several years, he mounted an intensive propaganda campaign, feeding sensational stories to newspapers, testifying before Congress, and cultivating relationships with politicians and journalists who would amplify his message. His tool was what he called his gore file, a collection of newspaper clippings and anecdotal reports linking marijuana to violent crimes, insanity, and moral degradation. Many of these stories were exaggerated, taken out of context, or simply false. But they were effective. Newspapers, particularly those owned by William Randolph Hearst, published lurid accounts of murders and assaults supposedly committed by people crazed on marijuana. The racism was often explicit. Anslinger himself was quoted as saying things like, "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men," a statement that reveals the ugly prejudice underlying much of the prohibitionist campaign. Popular culture reinforced these messages. The 1936 film Reefer Madness, originally titled Tell Your Children, depicted marijuana as a substance that transformed innocent teenagers into deranged criminals in a matter of weeks or even days. The film, sponsored by a church group as a morality tale, has become infamous for its hysterical exaggerations, but it reflected and reinforced the moral panic that Anslinger and others were deliberately cultivating. By 1937, Anslinger had built enough political support to push for federal legislation. The Marijuana Tax Act, introduced in April of that year, didn't technically outlaw marijuana. Instead, it imposed a prohibitive tax structure on all marijuana transactions. Anyone growing, selling, or prescribing marijuana would need to register with the federal government, maintain detailed records, purchase tax stamps for each transaction, and pay substantial fees. The structure was deliberately onerous. Compliance was made so difficult and expensive that it effectively ended legal commerce in marijuana, except for a few government-authorized uses. The penalties for failing to comply were severe, up to $2,000 in fines and 5 years in prison. The law followed the model of earlier prohibitory tax schemes, particularly the National Firearms Act, using the government's power to tax as a backdoor method of prohibition. The congressional hearings on the bill were brief and one-sided. Anslinger testified extensively, presenting his collection of scary stories. Few opposing voices were heard. The American Medical Association sent a representative, Dr. William C. Woodward, who tried to explain that cannabis was a recognized medicine and that the proposed law would interfere with legitimate medical practice. His testimony was largely ignored, and he was treated dismissively by committee members who had already decided the outcome. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Marijuana Tax Act into law on August 2, 1937. On the very first day of enforcement, federal agents arrested two men in Denver, Moses Baca, caught with a small amount of marijuana, and Samuel Caldwell, accused of dealing. Both were convicted, becoming the first people imprisoned under federal marijuana prohibition. Baca received 18 months. Caldwell, facing more serious charges as a dealer, was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in Leavenworth Penitentiary. The immediate effects were dramatic and unequal. People who had used marijuana medicinally or recreationally now faced criminal penalties. Farmers who had grown hemp found their crop suddenly entangled in regulations that made cultivation barely worth the effort. The hemp industry, already declining due to competition from synthetic fibers, collapsed almost entirely. Most significantly, enforcement fell disproportionately on communities of color. Despite similar usage rates across racial groups, police and prosecutors targeted African American and Latino communities far more aggressively than white communities. The pattern established in these early years of federal prohibition, where drug laws became tools for social control and racial oppression, would persist and intensify over the following decades. It's worth noting a remarkable exception to the prohibition regime that appeared just a few years after the Marijuana Tax Act became law. When the United States entered World War II, and Japanese forces cut off American access to Manila hemp and other fiber sources in Southeast Asia, the government suddenly needed domestic hemp production. Despite the Marijuana Tax Act still being in effect, the Department of Agriculture launched a program encouraging farmers to grow hemp for the war effort. They even produced a film, Hemp for Victory, explicitly calling hemp crucial to winning the war. The contradiction was stunning. The same federal government that had criminalized cannabis just 5 years earlier was now paying farmers to grow it and praising hemp as a patriotic crop. Between 1942 and 1945, American farmers planted hundreds of thousands of acres of hemp. Then, when the war ended, Prohibition returned in full force, and the last commercial hemp fields disappeared by the late 1950s. The scientific revolution, discovering what makes cannabis work. While political and legal battles raged around cannabis, scientific understanding of the plant remained surprisingly limited well into the 20th century. Chemists had identified some compounds in cannabis, but the main psychoactive component, the molecule responsible for cannabis's mind-altering effects, remained elusive. Other drugs' active ingredients had been isolated much earlier. Morphine was extracted from opium in the early 19th century. Cocaine was isolated from coca leaves in the 1860s. But cannabis proved more challenging. Its active compounds don't form salts, which makes them harder to isolate using traditional methods. And cannabis contains many different compounds, making it difficult to determine which ones mattered most. The breakthrough came in Israel in 1964, when a young chemist named Raphael Mechoulam and his colleague Yechiel Gaoni succeeded in isolating and characterizing the structure of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the compound we now know as THC. Mechoulam's work was meticulous. He obtained a supply of Lebanese hashish from Israeli police, who were willing to provide research material, and set to work separating and identifying its chemical components. The isolation of THC was transformative for cannabis research. For the first time, scientists had a pure, defined compound they could study systematically. They could investigate how it affected brain cells, what receptors it bound to, what its metabolites were, how long it remained in the body. Cannabis research could move from the realm of whole plant preparations, with their complex and variable chemistry, into the more precise world of molecular pharmacology. But the most revolutionary discovery was still to come. If THC was producing its effects by binding to some target in the brain, that target must exist for a reason. The human brain didn't evolve receptors just in case someone might smoke cannabis someday. There had to be naturally occurring molecules in the body that normally interact with whatever THC was binding to. In the late 1980s, American researcher Alan Howlett and her colleagues identified the first cannabinoid receptor, later named CB1. This receptor is found throughout the brain, particularly concentrated in areas involved in memory, movement, and pleasure. A few years later, a second receptor, CB2, was found primarily in immune cells and peripheral tissues. The discovery of cannabinoid receptors naturally led to the question, what activates these receptors normally? In 1992, Mechoulam's team in Jerusalem isolated the first endogenous cannabinoid, a molecule produced by the body itself. They named it anandamide, from the Sanskrit word ananda, meaning bliss or joy. A few years later, they identified a second major endocannabinoid, 2-AG. These discoveries revealed something profound. Humans and other animals have an entire physiological system based on molecules that are chemically related to the compounds found in cannabis. This endocannabinoid system, as it came to be called, plays roles in regulating appetite, pain, sensation, mood, memory, immune function, and many other processes. It's not a system designed for intoxication. It's a fundamental part of how our bodies maintain balance and respond to stress, injury, and disease. The endocannabinoid system operates through a unique mechanism called retrograde signaling. When a nerve cell fires repeatedly and needs to tone down the signal, it releases endocannabinoids that travel backward across the synapse to the sending cell, binding to receptors there and saying, essentially, ease up. This feedback mechanism helps prevent runaway excitation or inhibition, keeping neural circuits balanced. Understanding this system opened entirely new avenues for both research and medicine. If you could manipulate the endocannabinoid system, you might be able to treat pain, reduce inflammation, control seizures, manage anxiety, stimulate appetite in wasting patients, or address numerous other medical needs. Pharmaceutical companies took notice. Research funding increased. Clinical trials began. Some of this research led to approved medicines. Dronabinol, a synthetic form of THC, was approved in the United States in the 1980s for treating nausea in chemotherapy patients and stimulating appetite in AIDS patients. Nabalone, a synthetic cannabinoid, was similarly approved. In the 2000s, a mouth spray called Satifex, containing both THC and CBD extracted from cannabis plants, was approved in several countries for treating spasticity in multiple sclerosis patients. But progress was frustratingly slow, hampered by the legal status of cannabis. Research on Schedule I substances faces extraordinary regulatory hurdles. Scientists need special licenses, must store their research materials in high-security facilities, and can only obtain cannabis from a single government-approved source, which for decades provided only limited varieties. These restrictions significantly slowed the pace of research compared to what might have been possible if cannabis were treated like any other potential medicine. The discovery of CBD's medical potential came somewhat later and has followed a different trajectory. Cannabidiol, or CBD, is one of the major cannabinoids in cannabis, but unlike THC, it doesn't produce intoxication. For years, researchers largely overlooked it, assuming that if it didn't make people high, it probably wasn't very important. This turned out to be spectacularly wrong. CBD has demonstrated effectiveness in treating certain severe forms of childhood epilepsy, particularly Dravet's syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. These are devastating conditions where children suffer from frequent, severe seizures that don't respond well to conventional treatments. In clinical trials, CBD reduced seizure frequency significantly in many patients. In 2018, the FDA approved Epidiolex, a purified CBD extract, specifically for these conditions. It was the first cannabis-derived medicine to receive FDA approval. The scientific understanding of cannabis and cannabinoids has thus undergone a complete revolution over the past 60 years. We've gone from barely understanding what made cannabis psychoactive to mapping an entire physiological system, identifying its natural signaling molecules, and developing targeted medicines. But this scientific progress occurred in parallel with, and often in conflict with, political and legal developments that were following their own very different logic. The war on drugs, mass incarceration, and social control. While scientists were making breakthrough discoveries about how cannabis worked at the molecular level, the political and legal landscape around cannabis was hardening into something far more punitive than the Prohibition regime of the 1930s. The period from the 1960s through the 1990s saw cannabis transformed from a relatively minor concern of law enforcement into a central target of an enormous, militarized drug control apparatus that would incarcerate millions of Americans and reshape entire communities. The immediate context was the cultural upheaval of the 1960s. Cannabis use spread rapidly among young people, particularly college students, anti-war activists, and the counterculture. For many young Americans, smoking marijuana became a form of rebellion, a rejection of the values and authority of their parents' generation. The plant became entangled with rock music, with opposition to the Vietnam War, with sexual liberation, with a whole complex of social changes that many older, more conservative Americans found threatening. President Richard Nixon, elected in 1968, partly on a platform of law and order, saw political opportunity in the anxiety that these social changes provoked. In 1971, he declared drug abuse public enemy number one and launched what he explicitly called a war on drugs. Years later, a former aide would admit that this war had two targets: the anti-war left and black people. The aide, John Ehrlichman, was quoted as saying that by associating the anti-war movement with marijuana and black people with heroin, they could disrupt both communities through aggressive law enforcement. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 established the framework that still governs drug policy in the United States today. It created a scheduling system ranking drugs by their supposed danger and medical utility. Cannabis was placed in Schedule 1, defined as having high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, and unsafe even under medical supervision. This scheduling put cannabis in the same category as heroin, legally speaking more dangerous than cocaine or methamphetamine, which are Schedule 2. The absurdity of this classification was apparent even at the time. Nixon himself had appointed a commission led by former Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer to study marijuana and recommend policy. The Schaefer Commission, after extensive research and hearings, recommended decriminalizing possession of small amounts of marijuana. The report concluded that marijuana was less harmful than alcohol, that criminal penalties were counterproductive, and that the law enforcement resources devoted to marijuana arrests would be better spent elsewhere. Nixon rejected the Commission's recommendations outright. The political imperative, the desire to appear tough on crime and drugs, overwhelmed any consideration of evidence or expert advice. Cannabis would remain Schedule I, and enforcement would intensify. The Reagan administration in the 1980s took the war on drugs to new extremes. The Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 1988 established mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, expanded asset forfeiture powers that allowed police to seize property linked to drug crimes, and funneled enormous amounts of money to law enforcement. The rhetoric became militaristic. Police departments acquired military equipment through federal programs. SWAT teams proliferated. The language shifted from public health to warfare. The human cost was staggering. Arrests for marijuana offenses skyrocketed. In 1970, there were fewer than 300,000 arrests for marijuana violations annually in the United States. By 2000, that number had more than doubled. Most of these arrests were for simple possession, not dealing or trafficking. People were going to jail, sometimes for years, for possessing amounts of marijuana that would fit in a pocket. The impact fell disproportionately on communities of color. Multiple studies have shown that marijuana use rates are roughly similar across racial groups, but Black and Latino people are arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated at far higher rates than white people for marijuana offenses. In some jurisdictions, Black people were 8 or 9 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white people, despite similar usage rates. The consequences of these arrests extended far beyond jail time. A drug conviction could mean loss of student financial aid, making higher education impossible. It could disqualify someone from public housing. It created a permanent record that made employment difficult to find. In many states, it meant loss of voting rights. The war on drugs became, in effect, a system for creating a permanent underclass, stripping people of opportunities and rights based on arrests that often stemmed from discriminatory enforcement. Families were torn apart. Children entered foster care because their parents were incarcerated for drug offenses. Communities with high arrest rates saw young men disappear into prisons for years. The economic impact was devastating in neighborhoods that were already struggling, as potential wage earners were removed and burdened with criminal records that made legitimate employment nearly impossible upon release. By the late 1990s, the United States had the highest incarceration rate in the world, with drug offenses driving much of that growth. Roughly 500,000 people were behind bars for drug offenses, more than the entire prison population had been 30 years earlier. State and federal governments were spending tens of billions of dollars annually on drug enforcement, incarceration, and interdiction efforts. Yet marijuana remained widely available. Usage rates didn't dramatically decrease despite the massive enforcement effort. The war on drugs had created an enormous punishment machine that generated immense human suffering without achieving its stated goal of significantly reducing drug use. It had, however, achieved other effects. It had expanded police powers, justified surveillance and intrusive law enforcement tactics, and reinforced racial hierarchies through discriminatory enforcement. The contradictions became increasingly stark. At the same time that police were arresting hundreds of thousands of people for marijuana possession, scientific understanding of cannabis was advancing rapidly. Researchers were discovering potential medical applications. The endocannabinoid system was revealing itself as a fundamental part of human physiology. The gap between scientific knowledge and legal policy had become a chasm. Compassion and politics. The medical marijuana movement. Resistance to the war on drugs took many forms, but perhaps the most effective challenge came from an unexpected place: the sick and dying. The medical marijuana movement that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s fundamentally changed the debate around cannabis by refocusing attention from recreational use and criminal justice to suffering and healing. The immediate catalyst was the AIDS epidemic. Beginning in the early 1980s, a mysterious new disease began killing people, mostly young gay men, in cities across America. At first, doctors didn't know what they were dealing with. By the mid-80s, the disease had been identified as AIDS, caused by HIV, but there was no treatment, no cure, only a long, painful decline toward death. People with AIDS faced multiple agonies. The disease itself caused wasting, a gradual loss of weight and muscle mass that left patients skeletal. Opportunistic infections brought pain, nausea, and disability, and the treatments, when they became available, often had severe side effects. AZT, one of the first antiretroviral drugs, caused terrible nausea. Chemotherapy for AIDS-related cancers did the same. Many patients simply couldn't eat, even when they desperately needed nutrition. Some of these patients discovered that marijuana helped. It eased their nausea. It stimulated their appetite. It helped them eat and keep food down, which meant they could maintain their weight and strength, which meant they could survive longer. For people facing a terminal diagnosis, cannabis offered a measure of relief and dignity. But marijuana was illegal. Schedule I, no accepted medical use. Patients who found relief in cannabis were forced to obtain it on the black market, risking arrest. If police found them with marijuana, they could be charged with a crime, even though they were using it as medicine to stay alive. This injustice sparked activism. In San Francisco, which had one of the largest AIDS populations in the country, a woman named Mary Jane Rathbun, known affectionately as Brownie Mary, began baking marijuana-laced brownies and giving them to AIDS patients. She wasn't subtle about it. When police arrested her for possession with intent to distribute, she became a cause célèbre. Here was a gray-haired grandmother, clearly not a drug dealer in any conventional sense, facing criminal charges for trying to help dying people eat. Brownie Mary's case galvanized public opinion in San Francisco. The charges were eventually dropped, and she continued her work, becoming a symbol of compassionate care versus blind enforcement of unjust laws. But she wasn't alone. Dennis Peron, a gay rights and marijuana activist, opened the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club in 1991, openly selling marijuana to patients with a doctor's note. It was technically illegal, but local authorities largely left it alone, recognizing the humanitarian need it served. The San Francisco model spread. Buyers clubs opened in other cities. They operated in a legal gray zone, neither fully legal nor aggressively prosecuted, tolerated because they served a population that had been abandoned by conventional medicine and government. These weren't recreational dispensaries. They were places where sick people, many of them visibly ill, came seeking relief. The movement gained political traction. In 1996, California activists gathered enough signatures to place a medical marijuana initiative on the ballot. Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, would allow patients with a doctor's recommendation to possess and cultivate marijuana for medical use. It wouldn't make marijuana legal for everyone, just for patients with serious conditions. The campaign for Proposition 215 featured heart-wrenching stories: AIDS patients who could finally eat, cancer patients whose chemotherapy nausea was relieved, people with chronic pain who found relief after years of suffering. The opposition, led by law enforcement groups and the federal government, argued that the measure was a Trojan horse for legalization, that it would send the wrong message to children, that marijuana had no legitimate medical use. California voters sided with the patients. In November 1996, Proposition 215 passed with nearly 56% of the vote. For the first time since Prohibition began, a state had created a legal framework for medical marijuana, setting state law directly against federal law, which still classified cannabis as Schedule I with no medical value. The federal government's response was swift and angry. The Clinton administration, through officials including Attorney General Janet Reno and drug czar Barry McCaffrey, announced plans to prosecute doctors who recommended marijuana and to revoke their licenses to prescribe controlled substances. This was an extraordinary threat, essentially attempting to silence doctors through intimidation. But the doctors and patients fought back. With support from the ACLU, they sued, arguing that the federal government was violating doctors' First Amendment rights to speak with their patients and patients' rights to receive medical advice. The courts agreed. Federal judges ruled that doctors could recommend marijuana without facing federal prosecution, though they couldn't actually prescribe it or provide it, since it remained federally illegal. Proposition 215's passage opened floodgates. Other states began considering their own medical marijuana laws. Some, like Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, passed initiatives similar to California's. Others, like Hawaii and Vermont, enacted medical marijuana laws through their legislatures. Each state created slightly different rules, but the basic principle was the same. Patients with serious conditions and a doctor's recommendation could legally possess and use marijuana under state law. The federal government found itself in an awkward position. Federal law still prohibited marijuana entirely, but multiple states had created exceptions. Federal agents could still arrest people for marijuana possession even in medical marijuana states, but doing so increasingly looked cruel and unreasonable, particularly when the people being arrested were visibly sick. Different presidential administrations handled this tension differently. The Obama administration, starting in 2009, issued guidelines directing federal prosecutors to deprioritize cases against individuals complying with state medical marijuana laws, as long as they weren't engaged in large-scale trafficking or other problematic conduct. The Trump administration, particularly under Attorney General Jeff Sessions, rescinded those guidelines, though actual enforcement remained patchy. The medical marijuana movement succeeded not just in changing laws, but in changing hearts and minds. By putting human faces on cannabis use, by showing that marijuana could ease suffering and improve quality of life, advocates shifted public opinion. Polls showed increasing support for medical marijuana, even among people who opposed recreational legalization. The movement also exposed the scientific and moral bankruptcy of Schedule I classification. How could a substance have no accepted medical use when thousands of doctors were recommending it and hundreds of thousands of patients were finding relief? The contradiction became impossible to ignore. By 2020, more than 30 states had legalized marijuana for medical use in some form. The details varied widely. Some states had relatively restrictive programs limited to a few specific conditions. Others, like California, effectively allowed doctors broad discretion. Some states created elaborate regulatory systems with testing labs, licensed dispensaries, and patient registries. Others had more minimal infrastructure. Critics argued that medical marijuana laws were often a backdoor to quasi-legalization, that many patients weren't genuinely ill and were simply using doctor recommendations as a way to legally obtain marijuana for recreational use. There was some truth to this. In states with loose guidelines, it wasn't difficult to get a recommendation. But this criticism missed the larger point. Even if some people were gaming the system, many others were genuinely sick and genuinely helped. The existence of some abuse didn't negate the suffering that medical marijuana relieved. The scientific evidence base for medical marijuana, while growing, remained frustratingly incomplete. Schedule I status made research difficult. Most doctors weren't trained in cannabis medicine. Standardization remained a challenge when dealing with a plant containing dozens of active compounds rather than a single pharmaceutical. But clinical experience and patient reports couldn't be entirely dismissed. Doctors who worked with medical marijuana patients saw improvement in conditions ranging from chronic pain to PTSD to epilepsy. In 2018, the FDA's approval of Epidiolex, a CBD-based medication for rare childhood epilepsies, provided powerful validation. Here was a cannabis-derived medicine that met the highest standards of pharmaceutical testing and approval. The medical marijuana movement ultimately accomplished something more important than just changing laws. It made marijuana a political issue that couldn't be addressed solely through law enforcement and moral condemnation. It forced a conversation about patients' rights, about the limits of federal power over state decisions, about the disconnect between scientific understanding and legal classification, and about whether compassion and common sense should sometimes override rigid adherence to prohibition. The New Frontier, Legalization and its Discontents. The success of the medical marijuana movement created momentum for a more radical step: full legalization of cannabis for adult recreational use. This wasn't a new idea. Legalization advocates had existed since the beginning of Prohibition, but for decades they had been politically marginal, dismissed as hopeless idealists or closeted potheads. The transformation of medical marijuana from a fringe cause to mainstream policy in dozens of states made recreational legalization seem possible in a way it hadn't before. Colorado and Washington led the way. In November 2012, both states passed ballot initiatives legalizing marijuana for adult use. Amendment 64 inches Colorado, and Initiative 502 inches. Washington created frameworks where adults 21 and older could legally purchase, possess, and consume marijuana. Both states established systems to license and regulate marijuana businesses, from cultivation through retail sale. The passage of these initiatives marked a historic turning point. For the first time since the 1930s, states were explicitly rejecting federal prohibition and creating legal markets for a substance the federal government still classified as Schedule 1. The Obama administration, faced with this direct challenge to federal authority, chose not to intervene aggressively. Instead, the Justice Department issued the Cole Memorandum, guidance directing federal prosecutors to focus on serious problems like trafficking to minors or diversion to states where marijuana remained illegal, rather than targeting individuals and businesses complying with robust state regulatory systems. The Colorado and Washington experiments faced enormous challenges. No modern American state had ever tried to regulate the production and sale of marijuana. There were no established best practices, no model regulations to copy. Everything had to be figured out from scratch. How should licenses be issued? How should products be tested for safety and potency? How should businesses be taxed? What kinds of marketing should be allowed? Where could dispensaries be located? How would law enforcement handle issues like impaired driving? Both states took different approaches to these questions, creating natural laboratories for comparing regulatory strategies. Colorado allowed some vertical integration and private dispensaries. Washington created a more tightly controlled system with fewer licenses. Both implemented seed-to-sale tracking, requiring every plant and product to be monitored through the supply chain to prevent diversion to the black market. The results were mixed but generally more positive than many critics had predicted. Marijuana-related traffic fatalities didn't spike. Teen use rates didn't dramatically increase. The black market didn't disappear, but it shrank as legal options became available. Tax revenue exceeded expectations, providing hundreds of millions of dollars for education, drug treatment, and other state programs. But problems emerged too. The federal prohibition on marijuana created a bizarre situation where state legal marijuana businesses couldn't access normal banking services. Banks, regulated by federal authorities and worried about money laundering charges, refused to work with marijuana companies. This forced dispensaries to operate largely in cash, creating security concerns and making normal business operations difficult. The lack of research and standardization meant that product safety and consistency varied. Some companies sold products with wildly inaccurate labeling. Edibles, in particular, proved problematic. It's easy to eat too much of a marijuana-infused candy or brownie and experience a very unpleasant overdose. Not medically dangerous, but extremely uncomfortable and frightening. States had to develop packaging requirements, serving size limits, and testing protocols through trial and error. Social equity concerns emerged as a central issue. The war on drugs had devastated communities of color through decades of discriminatory enforcement. Now that marijuana was becoming legal and profitable, who would benefit from the new industry? Would it be the same communities that had suffered under Prohibition, or would it be wealthy, predominantly white entrepreneurs who had the capital and connections to navigate complex licensing processes? Many states tried to address this through social equity programs. Illinois, when it legalized marijuana in 2019, included provisions for expunging prior marijuana convictions and prioritizing license applications from individuals who had been convicted of marijuana offenses or who came from communities with high rates of marijuana arrests. California, Massachusetts, and other states created similar programs. But good intentions often ran into practical obstacles. Licensing processes were complex and expensive, requiring business plans, security measures, and significant capital. People from communities hardest hit by the war on drugs often lacked access to the capital and expertise needed to navigate these requirements. Well-funded operators could hire consultants and lawyers. Small applicants frequently couldn't compete. Some cities experimented with more aggressive approaches. Oakland set aside licenses specifically for equity applicants. Los Angeles created incubator programs to help equity applicants get started. These programs had mixed success, sometimes helping create genuinely community-based businesses, sometimes being gamed by larger operators who partnered with equity applicants primarily to access set-aside licenses. The proliferation of recreational legalization didn't stop with Colorado and Washington. By 2025, more than 20 states had legalized marijuana for adult use through either ballot initiatives or legislative action. Each state created its own regulatory structure, resulting in a patchwork of different rules, different tax rates, different approaches to social equity, and different degrees of success. The variety of approaches created valuable data. Researchers could compare outcomes across states with different policies, identifying what worked and what didn't. High taxes drove some consumers back to the black market. Low taxes provided less revenue for state programs. States that allowed home cultivation saw less growth in commercial markets, but fewer concerns about monopolization. States that heavily restricted licenses created opportunities for well-connected operators, but limited competition. The normalization of marijuana through legalization brought cultural shifts. In legal states, marijuana advertising became common, though subject to restrictions similar to those on alcohol. Dispensaries designed their stores to look like Apple stores or Whole Foods, emphasizing cleanliness and professionalism to counter stoner stereotypes. Cannabis became an industry, complete with trade shows, business conferences, and lobbyists. This commercialization troubled some activists who had fought for legalization. They had imagined a cottage industry, small growers and artisanal producers, not corporations and venture capital. The reality was more complicated. Small operators existed but struggled to compete with larger, better-funded businesses. Multi-state operators bought up licenses and consolidated operations, pursuing the same economies of scale that drive consolidation in any industry. The public health implications of legalization remained uncertain and contested. Proponents pointed to studies showing no dramatic increases in problematic use, particularly among young people. They noted that legal markets could be regulated for safety in ways black markets couldn't. They emphasized the racial justice benefits of no longer arresting hundreds of thousands of people for marijuana possession. Critics worried about increased availability leading to increased use, particularly of high-potency products. Marijuana had gotten much stronger over the decades, with THC concentrations in some products reaching levels never seen historically. The health effects of regular use of such high-potency products, particularly during adolescence when brains are still developing, weren't fully understood. The connection between marijuana use and mental health, particularly psychosis, remained a subject of intense debate and ongoing research. Heavy marijuana use, especially of high THC products, appeared to be associated with increased risk of psychotic symptoms in some people, particularly those with genetic vulnerability. But the relationship was complex, not deterministic. Most people who used marijuana, even heavily, didn't develop psychosis. The challenge was identifying who was at risk and how to minimize harm. Impaired driving presented another challenge. Unlike alcohol, where blood alcohol concentration correlates reasonably well with impairment, the relationship between THC levels and impairment was more complex. THC can remain detectable in blood long after its impairing effects have worn off, making it difficult to establish fair and effective legal limits. States experimented with different approaches: per se limits, impairment-based assessments, combinations of chemical tests, and field sobriety evaluations. The most significant uncertainty about legalization was the long-term effects on public health, particularly adolescent use. The brain continues developing into the mid-20s, and there was evidence that heavy marijuana use during this critical period could affect cognitive development, particularly memory and executive function. How would legalization, with its increased availability and normalization, affect patterns of use among young people? Early data suggested that teen use rates hadn't dramatically increased in legal states, but longer-term studies would be needed to fully understand the impacts. The international picture, a global shift. While the United States grappled with the contradictions between federal prohibition and state legalization, international drug policy was undergoing its own slow transformation. The global drug control system, established through treaties in the 1960s and 70s, had long treated cannabis as a dangerous drug with no legitimate uses. But as more countries reconsidered their cannabis policies, pressure built to reform the international framework. Uruguay became the first country to fully legalize marijuana at the national level in 2013 under President José Mujica. The Uruguayan system was unique. A state-controlled market where marijuana could only be purchased by registered users at pharmacies, grown at home within strict limits, or cultivated in user clubs. The goal wasn't to create a commercial cannabis industry, but to undercut the black market while maintaining tight control. Canada followed in 2018, when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government legalized marijuana for adult use nationwide. Canada's approach was more commercial than Uruguay's, allowing private companies to obtain licenses for cultivation and retail sale, though subject to significant regulation. The Canadian legalization was particularly significant because Canada was a G7 nation, a close U.S. ally, and a major participant in international drug control efforts. Its decision to legalize represented a major crack in the global prohibition consensus. The Canadian decision created tension with international drug treaties, particularly the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, which required signatory nations to limit cannabis to medical and scientific uses. Canada didn't withdraw from the treaty but argued that its domestic legalization was consistent with treaty obligations because the treaty's fundamental purpose was protecting health and welfare, and Canada believed its regulatory approach would better achieve that goal than prohibition. The UN itself began reconsidering cannabis policy. The World Health Organization conducted a comprehensive review of cannabis and cannabinoids, concluding that the international scheduling of cannabis was out of step with current scientific evidence. In 2020, the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, following WHO recommendations, voted to remove cannabis and cannabis resin from Schedule 4 of the Single Convention, the most restrictive category. This didn't legalize cannabis internationally, but it recognized that cannabis had legitimate medical uses and wasn't as dangerous as substances like heroin. European countries took various approaches. The Netherlands had famously tolerated cannabis sales through coffee shops since the 1970s, though this was technically a policy of non-enforcement rather than legalization. Portugal decriminalized all drugs, including cannabis, in 2001, treating possession for personal use as an administrative rather than criminal matter, and emphasizing treatment over punishment. The results were generally positive. Problematic drug use decreased, overdose deaths fell, and the criminal justice system wasn't clogged with simple possession cases. Other European nations were more cautious. Germany approved medical marijuana in 2017 and later announced plans to legalize recreational use. Spain allowed private cannabis social clubs through a legal loophole. The United Kingdom maintained prohibition despite having robust medical cannabis programs in many other European countries. The patchwork of policies across Europe reflected ongoing debates about the proper balance between public health, personal freedom, and social order. In Latin America, where drug production and trafficking had fueled decades of violence, the debate over cannabis policy took on different dimensions. Countries that had borne enormous costs in the war on drugs, human costs in violence and corruption, financial costs in military and law enforcement spending, began questioning whether prohibition was worth it. Former presidents of Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil spoke out in favor of drug policy reform, arguing that the current approach had failed. Mexico, after a series of Supreme Court decisions finding prohibition unconstitutional, was moving toward legalization, though implementation remained incomplete and contested. The country faced the challenge of transitioning from a black market dominated by violent cartels to a regulated legal market, all while dealing with the legacy of decades of drug war violence. Cannabis policy in Africa varied widely, from strict prohibition to growing medical marijuana industries. Lesotho, a small nation surrounded by South Africa, licensed cannabis cultivation for export to international medical markets, seeing economic opportunity in a crop that grew well in the local climate. South Africa's Constitutional Court ruled that adults had a right to use marijuana in private, though commercial sales remained illegal. Several other African nations were reconsidering their policies, balancing prohibition's costs against concerns about public health and social order. Asia remained largely resistant to cannabis policy reform, with severe penalties for possession still common in countries like Singapore, Japan, and Indonesia. Cultural attitudes toward drugs tended to be more conservative, and governments were often unwilling to challenge international prohibition norms. Thailand was an exception, legalizing medical marijuana and later decriminalizing cannabis, seeing potential economic benefits in cannabis tourism and agriculture. The global picture by the mid-2020s was one of increasing divergence. The unified prohibition regime that had dominated international drug policy for half a century was fragmenting, replaced by a variety of approaches ranging from strict prohibition to full commercialization. This created opportunities for policy innovation and learning from different countries' experiments, but it also created tensions and challenges, particularly for international trade and travel. Looking forward, unresolved questions and future paths. As we move deeper into the 21st century, cannabis stands at a remarkable crossroads. A plant that was nearly universally prohibited just a generation ago is now legal for medical use in much of the developed world and legal for recreational use in a growing number of jurisdictions. Yet fundamental questions remain unresolved, and the path forward is anything but clear. The scientific questions are substantial. Despite decades of research since Mechoulam's isolation of THC, we still don't fully understand how cannabis affects the brain and body, particularly with long-term use. The endocannabinoid system is proving more complex than initially thought, with new receptors, signaling molecules, and interactions continuing to be discovered. Understanding this system better may lead to new medicines, not necessarily derived from the cannabis plant but designed to interact with cannabinoid receptors in precise ways. The long-term public health effects of legalization remain unknown. We have decades of data on tobacco and alcohol, allowing us to quantify their health impacts with some precision. Cannabis legalization is too recent for similar long-term data. Will increased availability and social acceptance lead to significantly higher rates of problematic use? Will high-potency products prove more harmful than traditional marijuana? How will patterns of use evolve as cannabis becomes more normalized? The question of cannabis's effects on adolescent brain development is particularly pressing. The evidence suggests that heavy use during adolescence can affect cognitive function, at least in some individuals, but the details remain uncertain. How much use is risky? What individual factors make some people more vulnerable? How can we effectively prevent youth use in a context where adult use is legal and increasingly normalized? The relationship between cannabis use and mental health, particularly psychosis and schizophrenia, continues to generate research and controversy. The evidence suggests that cannabis use, particularly heavy use of high THC products, increases psychosis risk in vulnerable individuals, but not in everyone. The mechanisms aren't fully understood, and the risk factors aren't well enough characterized to guide individual decisions. As high-potency products become more available in legal markets, understanding these risks becomes more urgent. The social justice dimensions of cannabis policy remain largely unresolved. States have made various efforts to repair the harms caused by decades of prohibition, particularly to communities of color. Expungement programs have cleared some criminal records. Social equity programs have tried to ensure that communities most harmed by prohibition benefit from legalization. But these efforts have had mixed success, often failing to overcome the structural inequalities that made enforcement discriminatory in the first place. The question of how to prevent the cannabis industry from following the path of the tobacco and alcohol industries looms large. Those industries, driven by profit maximization, targeted vulnerable populations, marketed heavily to young people, and resisted public health regulation. There are signs that the cannabis industry could follow similar paths. Aggressive marketing, development of high-potency products optimized for heavy use, and lobbying against regulation. How can legal cannabis markets be structured to minimize these risks? Banking remains a practical problem in the United States. Until federal law changes, state legal cannabis businesses can't access normal banking services, forcing many to operate largely in cash with all the attendant problems. Legislative efforts to provide safe harbor for banks working with cannabis businesses have repeatedly stalled in Congress. Until this is resolved, the industry operates under an artificial handicap that creates security risks and makes normal business operations difficult. The tax structure for cannabis businesses is another federal policy artifact that creates problems. Because cannabis remains federally illegal, cannabis businesses can't deduct normal business expenses on their federal tax returns, only direct costs of goods sold. This creates enormous tax burdens, with effective tax rates sometimes exceeding 70% of income. The policy makes it nearly impossible for legal cannabis businesses to compete with the untaxed black market on price while remaining profitable. The international drug control system remains in flux. The UN's decision to partially reschedule cannabis was significant symbolically, but it didn't change the fundamental treaty obligations that require countries to limit cannabis to medical and scientific uses. Countries like Canada and Uruguay have essentially said they'll interpret those obligations in their own way, prioritizing domestic policy over strict treaty compliance. This approach works as long as other countries don't challenge it too aggressively, but it leaves the international legal situation ambiguous. The future may see continued divergence, with different countries and different U.S. states taking different approaches based on their own cultures, priorities, and experiences. This diversity could be valuable, creating natural experiments from which we can learn, or it could create conflicts and coordination problems, particularly as people and products move across borders. One possible path forward is a public health approach that prioritizes harm reduction over prohibition or unfettered commercialization. This approach would recognize that people use cannabis and probably always will, just as they use alcohol and tobacco. The question then becomes not how to eliminate use, but how to minimize harms while respecting personal freedom. This might mean robust regulation of commercial markets, limiting marketing, restricting potency of easily available products, and requiring honest labeling. Extensive public education, particularly for young people, about risks and safer use practices, without resorting to discredited scare tactics. Investment in treatment and support for people who develop problematic use patterns. Continued research to better understand both risks and benefits. And ongoing attention to social justice, ensuring that prohibition's harms are addressed and that legal markets benefit communities rather than exploiting them. Another path would emphasize commercialization and economic development. Cannabis is a lucrative industry, generating billions in sales and tax revenue. Some jurisdictions may choose to embrace this economic opportunity, encouraging business development while maintaining minimum necessary regulation. This approach might generate jobs and revenue, but it risks creating an industry focused on maximizing consumption rather than promoting health. A third path might maintain or even tighten restrictions, particularly if evidence emerges of significant public health harms from legalization. Some jurisdictions, looking at data from early legalizing states or countries, might decide that legalization's costs outweigh its benefits and maintain or even strengthen prohibition. This seems unlikely given current trends, but it remains possible. The most probable scenario is continued messy diversity, with different jurisdictions trying different approaches, adjusting their policies based on experience and local preferences, and learning or failing to learn from each other. Cannabis policy will remain contested, subject to ongoing debate and revision for the foreseeable future. What seems clear is that we've moved past the point where simple prohibition is politically sustainable or morally defensible. Too many people have seen cannabis's medical benefits. Too many communities have been harmed by discriminatory enforcement. Too many states have successfully implemented alternatives to prohibition. The question is no longer whether to reform cannabis policy, but how to do so in ways that maximize benefits and minimize harms. Conclusion: a plant and its people. And so we come to the end of our long journey through cannabis history. From ancient shamans' tombs on the Central Asian steppe to 21st century dispensaries in Denver and Amsterdam. From traditional Chinese medicine to molecular neuroscience. From ships rigging in the age of sail to social justice movements in our own time, what have we learned? Perhaps most importantly, that cannabis's story is not really about a plant at all. It's about people. How we've used a plant's properties to meet our needs. How we've woven it into our cultures and conflicts. How we've tried to control it and each other through laws and force. And how we've gradually, fitfully, moved toward more rational and humane approaches. Cannabis itself has no inherent moral character. It's a plant doing what plants do, growing, reproducing, responding to its environment. The compounds it produces evolved for the plant's own purposes, probably as defense against herbivores and pathogens. That these compounds happen to interact with receptors in the human brain is an accident of chemistry, a random intersection of plant and animal evolution. But humans have never treated cannabis as merely a plant. We've seen in it a source of fiber, food, and oil. We've seen medicine and poison, sacrament and vice, commodity and contraband. We've projected onto it our hopes and fears, our prejudices and ideals. The story of cannabis is, in this sense, a mirror reflecting human nature back at ourselves. The journey from prohibition to acceptance, from reefer madness to medical marijuana dispensaries, has been neither smooth nor inevitable. It required the courage of patients who publicly used cannabis for relief despite risking arrest. It required activists who persisted through decades when reform seemed impossible. It required scientists who studied cannabis despite the obstacles prohibition placed in their path. It required judges, legislators, and voters willing to question received wisdom and change course. The journey isn't over. Cannabis policy will continue evolving, sometimes progressing, sometimes regressing, always contested. New questions will arise as we accumulate experience with legal markets. Old questions will persist about health effects, social impacts, and the proper role of government in regulating personal behavior. But perhaps we've learned something valuable from the long, strange history of cannabis and prohibition. We've learned that moral panics make poor policy. We've learned that criminalizing a substance used by millions creates enormous collateral damage while failing to eliminate the substance. We've learned that some problems can't be arrested away. And we've learned that sometimes the most radical act is simply to question whether the way we've always done things is actually the best way forward. The plant that grew wild on the Asian steppe 8,000 years ago has accompanied humanity through our entire recorded history. It's been rope and clothing, food and medicine, religious sacrament and legal prohibition, medical breakthrough and social scourge. It's been whatever we've needed it to be, or feared it might become. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps think about that remarkable journey, about all the people through all the centuries who have grown cannabis, used it, fought over it, studied it, and tried to understand what it means for human life and society. Their story is our story, a small piece of the vast, complex, messy, beautiful history of human civilization. Thank you for joining me on this journey through cannabis history. If you enjoyed this exploration, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into fascinating historical topics. Leave a comment letting me know what you'd like to learn about next. Sweet dreams and good night.